My life had fallen into a routine so predictable that sometimes I wondered if I was even awake or just sleepwalking through the years. I woke up at the same time every morning, made breakfast for a husband who barely acknowledged my presence, and spent my days either cleaning or staring out the window, watching the world move while I stood still. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when my husband and I laughed, touched, and spoke as if we were the only two people in the world. But over time, the conversations grew shorter, the silence between us stretched longer, and the distance felt like a living thing. I used to fight it to try and bridge the gap between us. But eventually, I stopped trying. I had accepted that I was alone in this house, even when he was here. Then, one evening, he came home with news that shattered the monotony of my existence. "There's something I need to tell you," he said over dinner, his voice casual, as if he was commenting on the weather. He barely looked up from his plate. I set my fork down, already knowing that whatever he was about to say had nothing to do with us. "I'm bringing someone to stay with us for a while," he continued. "His name is Emmanuel." I blinked, caught off guard. "Who is Emmanuel?" "He's the son of an old friend," my husband said, still focused on his food. "You remember Joseph, don't you?" "Vaguely. A business partner, I thought, someone my husband had spoken of in passing." "What about him?" "He passed away last year," he said flatly, with no real sadness in his tone. "His son's been struggling. I told him I'd take him in for a little while, help him get on his feet." I hesitated. "And when exactly were you going to tell me this?" He finally looked at me then, an irritated glance as if I was being difficult for no reason. "I'm telling you now." I swallowed the frustration rising in my throat. He had already made his decision. I was just another person living in this house, expected to accommodate whatever he chose. "When is he coming?" I asked instead. "Tomorrow?" The answer came too quickly. He had known for days, maybe even weeks. I pressed my lips together and nodded. "Okay." And that was it. No further discussion, no consideration of my feelings. It had already been decided. Meeting Emmanuel. The next afternoon, Emmanuel arrived. The moment I opened the door, I felt the shift in the air. He stood in the doorway, tall and still, his dark eyes unreadable as they met mine. There was something about him that felt both quiet and present, as if he occupied the space around him in a way most people didn't. He wasn't a boy, not in the way my husband had described him. He was a man, mid-20s maybe. His skin was deep, smooth, his features sharp and defined. His posture was relaxed but assured, like someone who had been watching the world long before it ever noticed him. I swallowed. "You must be Emmanuel." He nodded. "Yes, Ma'am." His voice was deep but soft, polite. I stepped aside, letting him in, watching as he carried his single duffel bag into the house. My husband appeared, clapping him on the back in a way that felt rehearsed. "Glad you're here, son." Emmanuel smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thank you for having me." I forced a small smile in return. "I hope you'll be comfortable here." His gaze lingered on me for just a second too long. "Thank you, Ma'am," he said again, and just like that he was in our home, first subtle signs of unease. That night, over dinner, I noticed it for the first time. The way he watched me. It wasn't obvious, nothing someone else would have picked up on. My husband certainly didn't. But I felt it. His eyes on me, studying, lingering. When I met his gaze, he didn't look away. He held it, his expression unreadable, as if waiting to see what I would do. I broke the eye contact first, forcing myself to focus on my plate. I told myself I was imagining things. He was just polite, reserved, maybe even shy. There was nothing unusual about it, but as the days passed, I found myself noticing him more. How he always seemed to be nearby. If I was in the kitchen, he'd walk in, pretending to look for something. If I was in the living room, he'd sit in the corner saying nothing, just there. If I went outside to water the plants, I'd glance back and find him standing by the window, watching. Each time I told myself it was nothing, that I was being ridiculous. But at night, in the silence of my room, doubt crept in. And then came the footsteps. The first night, something felt wrong. The first time it happened, I had just fallen asleep. A faint creaking noise pulled me from the edge of unconsciousness. I lay still, listening, my heart slow but alert. The house was old. It made sounds, the wind outside, the settling of the walls. But then I heard it again. Footsteps, software deliberate, moving just beyond my bedroom door. I held my breath, straining to listen. My husband was snoring beside me, dead to the world. Turned my head toward the door, barely able to make out the faint outline of the handle in the darkness. Was someone standing there? I waited, frozen, for the sound to come again. But the house was silent. Maybe I had imagined it, maybe I was being paranoid, but my skin felt tight, my pulse too fast. I turned onto my back, staring at the ceiling, refusing to look at the door again. Minutes passed. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, it was morning. And the feeling was gone. I wanted to believe I had dreamed it, that it was all in my head. But deep down, something told me I hadn't. And I knew that whatever it wasn't over. Not yet. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that Emmanuel was just being polite, that I was over-analysing his presence. But as the days passed, those little moments, the ones I wanted to ignore, became harder to dismiss. I found myself noticing him more, not because I wanted to, but because he was always there. If I went to the kitchen, he was already standing by the counter, pretending to search for something in the cabinets. If I curled up in the living room with a book, he found a reason to join me, sitting just close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body. It was subtle at first. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I had spent so much time alone in this house that I had forgotten what it was like to have another person around. But then there were the looks. Whenever my husband was home, Emmanuel was different. Quiet, reserved, respectful. But when we were alone, his eyes changed. It wasn't obvious, nothing that would hold up as proof. But I could feel it. There was something about the way his gaze lingered just a second too long, the way his posture shifted when I entered a room, like he was waiting for something. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I felt my own awareness of him growing. One evening, I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard him enter behind me. The soft shuffle of his feet barely made a sound, but I felt him before I saw him. "Can I help with anything?" His voice was smooth, polite. There was nothing strange about the words themselves, but the way he said them, low and careful, sent a chill down my spine. "No, I'm fine," I said without turning around. I reached for the sugar jar on the top shelf. Before I could grasp it, he was behind me. "Here, let me." His arm reached past mine, his chest barely brushing my back as his fingers closed around the jar. He handed it to me slowly, deliberately, his fingertips grazing my wrist before pulling away. I froze. It was the first time he had touched me. It was fleeting, innocent enough that I had no reason to react. But my skin burned where his fingers had been. "Thank you," I murmured, forcing myself to turn away. He smiled. "Anything for you?" I didn't reply. I couldn't. At first his words were harmless. "You always keep this place so nice," he'd say. "I don't know how you do it." But then they became more personal. "You look beautiful in that dress." At dinner one night, he reached for the serving bowl at the same time I did. Our hands brushed, and I pulled away quickly. "You're always so careful," he said, his voice almost amused. "I don't bite." I forced a laugh, pretending it was nothing, but my hands were trembling under the table. Later that night, I stood in front of the mirror, running a brush through my hair. Had he meant anything by it? I told myself no, but the way my skin prickled, the way my heart raced whenever he got too close, those were things I couldn't ignore. That night, my husband was working late. I went to bed earlier than usual, trying to shake off the tension that had been building all day. The house was silent. I lay under the covers, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to take me. Then I heard it. My name. It was so soft I almost convinced myself it was my imagination, but when I turned my head toward the door, I saw his shadow through the small gap beneath it. My breath caught. I waited, not moving, not breathing. The shadow didn't move either. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard a whisper. I couldn't sleep. A chill ran down my spine. I sat up slowly. "Go back to your room, Emmanuel." Silence. Then finally the shadow disappeared. I didn't move until I heard his footsteps retreating down the hallway. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't in my head. I got up, crossed the room, and locked my bedroom door for the first time since moving into this house. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. My heart pounded in my ears. Maybe he hadn't meant anything. Maybe he really hadn't been able to sleep, but deep down I knew better. Because when he had whispered my name outside my door, it hadn't been the voice of someone looking for comfort. It had been something else entirely. The morning after the whisper outside my door, I woke up with an unease that refused to leave. Me. I had barely slept, replaying the moment over and over again. The way Emmanuel had stood outside my door, the way he had whispered my name in the dark. It was wrong, but the worst part was the doubt that crept in with the morning light. Had I imagined it? By the time I went downstairs, I had convinced myself that I needed to address it. I found him in the kitchen, sitting at the table, stirring a cup of tea like he hadn't been lurking outside my bedroom just hours ago. I hesitated for a moment, gathering my courage before finally speaking. "Did you come to my door last night?" He looked up, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, slow and easy, like I had asked him if he slept well. "You must have imagined it." His voice was calm, too calm. Something inside me twisted. "I wasn't imagining it," I said, my tone firmer than I expected. He took a slow sip of tea, eyes locked on mine. "Maybe it was the wind." I gritted my teeth. "The wind doesn't whisper names." A silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You seemed scared," he said softly, tilting his head slightly. "I didn't mean to frighten you." The way he said it made my skin prickle. He wasn't denying it anymore. He was testing me, pushing to see what I would do. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but before I could, my husband walked in, oblivious to the tension that had just filled the room. Emmanuel leaned back in his chair, smiling. And just like that, the conversation was over. I tried to shake it off. For the rest of the day, I avoided him, keeping busy with chores, keeping myself surrounded by walls. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I could feel his presence. By evening, exhaustion weighed on me. I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair, trying to breathe past the discomfort that had followed me all day. Then I felt it, a shift in the air, the unmistakable feeling of someone watching me. I lifted my gaze to the mirror, my heart stopped. He was standing in the doorway. I turned slowly, brush still clutched in my hand, breath caught in my throat. "Emmanuel!" He didn't flinch, he didn't look away. Then, after a moment, he smiled. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice smooth, like he was telling me something obvious. I swallowed, gripping the edge of the dresser to keep my hands from shaking. "Go to bed," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He lingered a second longer. Then, as if nothing had happened, he turned and disappeared down the hallway. The air in the room felt too tight, like I had just survived something without realizing it. I locked the door for the second night in a row. I told myself to keep my distance, but Emmanuel made it impossible. Everywhere I went, he was there. His presence became inescapable. Not loud, not aggressive, just constant. If I sat on the couch, he sat beside me, closer than necessary. If I reached for something, he was suddenly behind me, his hand brushing mine. Each moment was small, meaningless on its own, but together they became something else, something that made my skin feel too tight, something that made my breath catch in ways I didn't want to admit. One evening, after dinner, I stood by the sink, rinsing dishes, my body tense with the weight of the past few days. Then I felt it again, him, standing just behind me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body, even though we weren't touching. I forced myself to keep washing the plate in my hands. Then his fingers grazed my arm. I froze. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. My breath hitched. His fingers lingered for just a second too long before he pulled away. Silence hung in the air between us. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. Then, finally, I stepped away, heart hammering in my chest. It took everything in me not to turn around, not to look at him, not to acknowledge what had just happened. I left the kitchen without another word. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to push the moment in the kitchen out of my mind, trying to push him out of my mind. The way his fingers had felt against my skin, the way I had frozen, the way I hadn't moved. I hated myself for it, but I hated even more that I didn't know if I wanted it to stop. Then my phone vibrated. A single message flashed across the screen. "You can lock your door, but you can't lock what's inside you." I sat up, blood turning to ice. I stared at the message, hands trembling. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. Then slowly, I turned to look at the door. A shadow moved beneath the gap, and I knew, without a doubt, he was standing right outside. The next morning I woke up with a pounding heart, the weight of last night still sitting heavily on my chest. My phone screen was dark now, but I could still see the message burned into my memory. "You can lock the door, but you can't lock what's already inside. You." I had barely slept. Every sound in the house had made my skin prickle. Every shadow had felt like him standing outside my door, watching. I told myself that today would be different. I would create distance. I would put an end to whatever was happening before it could go further. But deep down, I knew that the moment for stopping this had already passed. I avoided Emmanuel as much as I could. I moved quickly from room to room, keeping myself busy, refusing to be alone for too long. If I sensed him nearby, I found an excuse to leave. But Emmanuel noticed. He always noticed. And instead of backing off, he did the opposite. Everywhere I turned, he was there. If I left the living room, I'd find him standing in the hallway. If I went outside to get some fresh air, he would appear at the window, watching. He wasn't saying anything, he wasn't touching me, but his presence was suffocating. That afternoon, as I stood in the laundry room, folding clothes, I felt him behind me. I didn't turn around, but I could hear his breathing, slow, steady, unshaken. I swallowed, gripping the fabric in my hands. "I don't like this, Emmanuel." A pause, then, very softly, "Like what?" I turned, finally looking at him. He was standing in the doorway, blocking the only exit. "This," I whispered. "The way you're always around, the way you look at me." He tilted his head slightly, as if amused. And how do I look at you?" I exhaled sharply, pushing past him. "I'm going to talk to my husband." This time he didn't stop me. That evening after dinner, I finally told my husband. I waited until Emmanuel had gone upstairs, his footsteps fading, before I turned to my husband and said, "I need to talk to you." He barely glanced up from his phone. "It's about Emmanuel." Now he looked up, frowning slightly. "What about him?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "He makes me uncomfortable." My husband frowned deeper. "Uncomfortable? How?" I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. "I don't know, I feel like he watches me. He's always close, and last night..." I stopped myself. I couldn't tell him about the text, or the way Emmanuel had whispered outside my door. My husband sighed, setting his phone down. "He's just a kid." I blinked. "He's not a kid, he's a man." "He's a lost boy who just lost his father," my husband said, shaking his head. "You're overthinking it." I clenched my fists. I know when something isn't right. But he only chuckled. "You're being dramatic, I promise, he's harmless." I stared at him, feeling something break inside me. I was alone in this. I had no one to turn to, no one who would believe me. That night, my husband had to work late again. The moment he left, the house felt different. I could feel it, the shift in the air, like something was waiting for me. I stayed in the living room, curling up on the couch, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. Then, after a while, I stood up to go to bed. As I walked down the hallway, I heard the softest shuffle behind me. I turned. Emmanuel was standing there. I sucked in a breath. He didn't move, neither did I. Then slowly, he stepped forward, blocking my path. I forced myself to stay calm. "Move." He didn't. Instead, his head tilted slightly, that same unreadable expression on his face. "Why do you keep running from me?" My stomach twisted. "I don't know what you're talking about." He took another step forward. I stepped back. He took another. I was cornered. My heart was hammering in my chest. I forced a laugh, desperate to shatter the moment. "You need to stop this. Whatever you think is happening..." "I don't think," he interrupted, his voice too quiet, too calm. "I know." I shivered. "Know what?" He didn't answer. Instead, his hand reached up, and before I could react, he tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. I flinched, but I didn't move away fast enough. His fingers lingered. He was testing me, daring me to push him away. "I know you feel it too," he whispered. I shoved him. Hard. I stumbled back, breathing heavily, shaking. He didn't try to stop me. He just watched me. Watched as I turned and ran into my room, slamming the door, locking it, pressing my back against the wood as I struggled to breathe. I stayed there for what felt like hours, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. The silence in the house was unbearable. I needed to do something. I needed to find a way to make this stop. Then my phone vibrated. I flinched. A single text message appeared on my screen. "You can lock the door, but you can't lock what's already inside you." The breath left my lungs. Number. I turned my head slowly, eyes drifting to the crack under the door. A shadow passed. He was standing right outside. I pressed a hand to my mouth to keep from gasping. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then the doorknob turned. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying. Then finally the shadow disappeared. His footsteps faded down the hallway. But I knew it wasn't over. No, not even close. The moment Emmanuel's footsteps faded down the hallway, I collapsed onto the bed, my whole body trembling. My hands gripped the sheets, trying to ground myself, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that he was still there, watching, waiting. For what, I didn't know. But I did know one thing: I couldn't live like this anymore. Tonight I was going to tell my husband everything. The house was silent the next morning, too silent. I forced myself to move, to act normal, even though my skin crawled with the memory of the night before. By the time I made my way back to my bedroom after showering, I was mentally preparing myself for what I had to do. I was done keeping quiet. I was done pretending this was okay. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through my texts. I had typed and erased a dozen messages to my husband. I wasn't sure how to put it into words, but I knew that by tonight, this secret would be over. Then I saw it. A note, folded neatly on my pillow. My blood ran cold before I even picked it up. With shaking fingers, I opened it. The message was simple. "If you tell him, I'll tell him what you've done too." I blinked. What I've done? A wave of nausea rolled through me. Had I done something? I racked my brain for anything he could be referring to, but my mind was blank. I hadn't crossed a line. I hadn't encouraged him. Had I? I sat down, gripping the note, my heart hammering. Flashes of past moments filled my head. The way my breath had caught when he brushed my arm. The way I had frozen instead of pushing him away faster. The way my hands had trembled when he tucked my hair behind my ear, but not from fear alone. Was it possible that somewhere in the back of my mind, I had wanted this? I swallowed hard. This was his game. He was playing me, twisting moments that meant nothing and making me question my own intentions. I took a deep breath and tore the note in half. Whatever he thought he had over me, it wasn't real. Tonight, he was leaving. By the time the sun had set, I was ready. I wasn't waiting for my husband anymore. I was handling this myself. I found Emmanuel in the living room, sitting on the couch like he owned the place. His long legs were stretched out, his expression calm, like he was expecting me. I clenched my fists. "You need to leave." He didn't react, didn't even blink. Instead, he let out a slow breath, tilting his head slightly. "I don't think you really want that." My skin crawled. "Get out." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're afraid?" I swallowed, my nails digging into my palms. "I'm not afraid of you." A smirk played on his lips. "That's not what I meant." I shook my head, forcing myself to take a step forward. "You can play your mind games with someone else. It's not working on me anymore." He just watched me, studying me like I was something to be figured out. Then slowly he stood up. For the first time I felt how tall he was, how much space he took up. But I didn't back down. Not this time. For a long moment we just stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. Then he leaned in, his voice just above a whisper. "I'll be here," my breath caught. "When you're ready." I shoved past him, my heart pounding, rushing to the door. I yanked it open, my voice shaking with rage. "Get out!" This time he listened. Without another word, he stepped outside. But before he left, he turned back, one last smirk curling on his lips. And then he was gone. The house felt different after he left, lighter, safer. But I wasn't stupid enough to believe that this was over. I spent the rest of the night pacing, my mind racing with everything that had happened. Would he actually tell my husband something? Would he twist the story so that it looked like I was the one at fault? Did I care? At this point, I just wanted my life back. By the time I finally crawled into bed, exhaustion hit me like a tidal wave. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could sleep, maybe even dream. I turned off the light, sinking into the mattress. And then I heard it. A single, slow, deliberate knock. My whole body stiffened. Another knock. Then silence. I turned my head slowly, my eyes locked on the door. The light from the hallway cast a faint glow beneath the crack. I held my breath, waiting, listening. Then a shadow moved. My stomach dropped, and just as I opened my mouth to scream, the lights went out.